All right. So today we're going to talk about the two main types of cells that exist on Earth. This is really the most zoomed out umbrella categories, the most broad types of cells that exist, and organisms that are made of these cell types. There's two. So let's take a look at the slides here. And here I really like this slide because it shows you a clear picture of these two cell types, and you can get a very obvious appreciation for some of the key distinctions and differences between the two. The two different cell types are prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic organisms made of prokaryotic cells, eukaryotic cells made of eukaryotic organisms made of eukaryotic cells. Okay. So one of the key differences, as you can see right off the bat, is that, and there's always an exception or two. I've probably said that many times before in biology, there's always an exception. But for the most part, eukaryotic cells are much larger than prokaryotic cells, as you can see. Roughly 10 times the diameter of a prokaryotic, typical prokaryotic cell. The other key difference that we're going to write down and explore is in complexity and in intracellular, so within the cellular, intracellular complexity and compartmentalization. And as you can see, the eukaryotic cell has this prominent structure called a nucleus. This is not to be confused with the nucleus of an atom. We're past that, and yes, they happen to name it the same thing, but the nucleus of an atom, of course, is much different than the nucleus of a cell. In fact, from here on out, we're really just talking about the nucleus of cells. And eukaryotic cells, eukaryotes, organisms made of these cells, have a nucleus in each of the cells. So we'll talk about its function and its role. Not today, but essentially the nucleus, we'll talk a little bit about it today, but the nucleus it houses the genetic material, DNA. DNA molecules are going to be stored in the nucleus. And we'll see that in prokaryotic cells, DNA is actually just kind of floating around in the fluid of the cell that we call the cytoplasm. Now, eukaryotic cells, in addition to a nucleus, have these specialized structures called organelles that prokaryotic cells lack. So we'll write this out and kind of explore this a bit. But you can see from this picture kind of an obvious difference. Now, here's more of like an artist's representation of a typical prokaryotic cell, a bacterial cell. As you can see, not much going on. A lot simpler, right? You've got a cell membrane, plasma membrane, a cell wall in the case of a bacterium. Some have this capsule and other structures like a pilus, but not much else going on internally, right? Whereas animal cells, which are eukaryotic, you can already see is just a lot more going on, a lot more complexity, right, with the animal cell, and a lot more structures playing different roles that we will certainly explore eventually. Plant cells as well, eukaryotic, they have a nucleus, and they have these organelle structures. But now let's be very specific and identify the key differences that make prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells different. And what types of organisms are made of these cells types, right? So oops. Yeah, we're gonna start with prokaryotic cells. So, okay. We're gonna start with our prokaryotic cells, or we can actually call them the organisms we can call prokaryotes for short. So, prokaryotes. We'll start there, and then we'll kind of compare and contrast, talk about our eukaryotes as well. But we'll start with the prokaryotes. And you know me, I really like to break down the word if it's going to inform what it's referring to or what it is, right? And so prokaryote, this prefix of pro means before. So maybe, you've seen this before, like the prologue of a book comes before the main story, right? And karyo actually refers to nucleus. And so that'll actually make a lot more sense when we look at endosymbiotic theory and the fact that prokaryotic cells and organisms actually existed on Earth before eukaryotes, some 3.8 billion years ago. But the point being is they don't have a nucleus, right? Okay, well, what organisms are prokaryotic? There's really two groups. So examples, there's two groups of organisms that are prokaryotic. They are bacteria and another group called archaea. So archaea and bacteria are prokaryotic. Interestingly enough, all bacteria and archaea are single-celled or unicellular. Unicellular and very small, like 1 to 2 micrometers in length, extremely small. So unicellular microorganisms. Now, what do I mean by unicellular? It means every individual organism is just one cell. It's not a clump of cells. It's not a tissue or collection, right? Whereas, of course, we know we, human beings, are not just one cell. We're actually trillions of cells that form tissues, and so muscle and skin and our brain and GI tract and all this. So these guys are a lot simpler, single-celled, right? Okay, well, what makes them prokaryotic? There's two qualifications here. The first is kind of what I've already said about the nucleus. They don't have a nucleus, so no nucleus. However, as we've talked about a little bit, every cell, every life form needs DNA, genetic material, to code for proteins, as we'll see later on. But really, you got to have DNA. And so the DNA of prokaryotic cells is actually not in this nuclear structure, the nucleus, but it's located in the fluid of the cell. Cells are kind of like water balloons in a way, and it's called the cytoplasm. So the DNA is located in the cytoplasm. And again, this is just, I'm kind of getting into the eukaryotes a little bit. I can erase just limited with my small whiteboard, but located in the cytoplasm, which is the fluid of the cell. So it's kind of just floating around there. And if you take microbiology, you'll learn that bacteria especially have, one main DNA molecule, one chromosome, but then they have these other extra chromosomal DNA molecules called plasmids, and they're all just floating around in the cytoplasm. Okay, second, as I mentioned, there's none of these organelles. Specifically, I really want to emphasize there's no membrane-bound organelles. I'm going to underline that. Membrane-bound organelles. Okay, so the reason I'm emphasizing this membrane-bound thing, most of the internal structures that perform really important functions in cells, these organelles, are surrounded by a membrane, okay? So within the cell, they have their own phospholipid bilayer membrane surrounding that structure. And we'll explore organelles in depth, all the membrane-bound ones that we'll find in the eukaryotes. But the clear important thing is there is one organelle that is crucial, essential for life. All cells need these organelles, but they're not surrounded by a membrane. And so prokaryotes have these, and we'll definitely mention them soon. But that's why I'm emphasizing that they don't have the membrane-bound ones, okay? Okay. So we'll come back to the prokaryotes. Just because I don't have much room for my eukaryotes here, I'm gonna erase this. But that's the summary of the prokaryotes, okay? Let's take a look at eukaryotes. So breaking down the word, eu is referring to true. So true, again, nucleus, just referring to the fact that eukaryotes and eukaryotic cells have nuclei, plural. So they all have a nucleus inside of the cell, a very prominent, pretty giant structure, and we call it a nucleus. Okay, well, examples of eukaryotes. I mentioned that all life on Earth, you're one of these two. You've got to just be one of the two. And so if bacteria and archaea are the prokaryotes, it must mean that everything else on Earth is eukaryotic. So what's everything else? Us, animals, right? So all the animals, plants, fungi, and this last group that not many people are aware of called protists. And protists are funny. They're kind of like the misfit outcast group where if it's a eukaryotic organism, and it doesn't quite fit into the other three kingdoms of organisms here, they just kind of threw it into the protists. Examples are like amoebas, seaweed, phytoplankton are technically protists, algae, all the algae species. All right. So really the two qualifications of eukaryotes are the opposite of the prokaryotes. So the first being that they have this nucleus. So have a nucleus And again, this is going to store DNA. So stores DNA. And secondly, they're going to have these membrane-bound organelles. I'm just going to write this slightly higher. So they have the membrane-bound organelles. Which we're going to talk a lot about next time. These are things like lysosomes and mitochondria and Golgi apparatus, endoplasmic reticulum, all these things. Okay, well, let's address the organelle that is universal and necessary. Every cell needs these to be in a living functioning cell. They're called ribosomes. So it's very important to know that every cell, prokaryotic or eukaryotic, has these structures, these organelles that are not surrounded by a membrane, which is the distinction there. And they're called ribosomes. So you can kind of write underneath that the prokaryotes have ribosomes. And the eukaryotes have ribosomes. All right. So my last thing that I want to mention here is just an analogy for the two cell types. It's one of my favorites. But yeah, let me take a seat. But that's really it when it comes to the specifics. So the last kind of fun analogy I like with these two types of cells, cell phones. Just realized it's a cell phone. That's funny. Well, being my age, when I was in school and around your ages, the cell phones were quite different. They would flip, so-called flip phones. And man, these things were primitive and very, basic. They didn't do much, but they got the job done and they did the essentials. So if you had a cell phone and I told you that it could only do two things, what would you say? Probably not TikTok. You would want it to call and text. And that's what these flip phones did. They just did the bare essentials for life. Well, we're getting there. So they called, they texted barely, and that's about it. Those are our prokaryotes, the flip phones, these ancient, very durable, survived every mass extinction, but you could like drop these, put them in the washing machine, like they could survive anything. And but they do the bare essentials, the crucial necessary functions to be a living thing. Now eukaryotes, on the other hand, those are your smartphones, those are your iPhones and whatever else there is. They've got the complexity, they've got the extra bells and whistles with the membrane-bound organelles. So play music, watch YouTube videos, Google things, whatever, right? There's all these different specialized fancy functions that they have, right? But they also can call in text. They can also do the bare minimum essential functions to live, which is why they have ribosomes and DNA. If you have ribosomes and DNA and a cell membrane, of course, I mean, that makes every cell needs that to make it a cell. Then you can function and thrive in this world, right? So, yeah, smartphones, flip phones. That's my analogy. They're cell phones. I think that's all I got. So that's it for Prof L for today. I'll see you next time.